Sylvain Laporte is president of the Canadian Space Agency. He's visiting the Wilson Centre today to take part in a conference organized by the Wilson Centre's Canada Institute that's taking a look at Canadian and U.S. cooperation in space. Welcome and thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here.
We did an earlier interview with your U.S. counterpart, Jim Bridenstine. And one of the things I asked him is that from my generation, there's a romantic look at NASA and the space program that's tied to the lunar landing. And I asked him, what is the image of the U.S. space program today? And so I'm wondering, how do you view the image of the Canadian space program today from the perspective of the average Canadian citizen?
Well, we probably have the same perspective, to be honest with you. So I'm of that generation of children that were woken up by their parents when we've had the first landing on the moon. I still remember it vividly on the very old black and white TV with a lot of snow. And Canadians grow up with that kind of perspective of space. So as you know, our relationship between the Canadian Space Agency and NASA grew over the years, and we continued to collaborate. I think one of the most visible contributions that Canadians have taken pride on is our participation in the shuttle program with the Canadarm and then the ISS, right, as we switch the Canadarm from the shuttle to the ISS. And then the contribution of the Canadarm in terms of building the ISS, the station itself, and now today with respect to its logistics or its maintenance capabilities out there. So I would share Jim's opinion, and it's a reflection of the fact that you know, we've had so much great collaboration over the last 56 years, in fact, between Canada and NASA. But it's a reflection of the fact that we have very similar principles, and we see the world with the same lens and the same filter. So typically what would have excited Americans with respect to the space program has in fact been a parallel in Canada, and the same excitement levels have been achieved there.
What is the level of cooperation and integration? How closely do you work together?
Oh, extremely closely. I've got teams deployed to various centers in NASA at any given time. We've got a full-time deployment in Houston to help with respect to the operation of the arm. And although I've got a similar setup in where we work in Saint-Hubert, Canada, and there's complete integration between our team in Canada and the Houston team, American team and Canadian team in Houston. So the integration is thorough. And when it comes to operations, it doesn't matter what country you're from. You've got a job to do. You've got a mission to perform. There may be life at stake. We operate as if we were one team.
What is the current level of support from the Canadian government?
Oh, the support is incredible. In fact, I work for Minister Baines, who is the Minister for Innovation, Science and Economic Development. And Minister Baines likes to open any kind of space discussion by saying that it's his preferred file. He's given us a tremendous amount of support. He gets a lot of pressure from his two girls that also love space and make sure that Dad keeps his eye on how the space file is doing in Canada. So he jokes a lot about that, but from a more serious perspective, he's been a great ally to the space program. So we're getting a lot of support.
Well, you bring up the two daughters, and I relate to that because I would consider myself, I don't know a space geek, a space fan, and it captures the imagination in ways that other government endeavors do not. So from an administrator's point of view, how do you manage that where you have practical considerations and line items and budgets and all the things that go into any big operation, but then there's this whole aspirational part of it that transcends, it's almost mythic. How do you manage those things?
Well,
they're not always in sync.
Well, I think the inspirational part, the aspirational part of space has been there, you know, all along. Today, I think we have a whole lot more fun with it. Right? So we've always had astronauts that inspired. We've always had missions that inspired. But I think, you know, over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, all of us that participate in space, so it's not a unique Canadian or a unique American perspective, but we've learned to realize how impactful what we do is to the youth out there and to the general population. And we're having a lot of fun with that. So one of the best parts of my job is to go into a school and talk to students. And in fact, they tend to be the most hostile of the audiences that I've ever faced, right? So they have, with Google and the internet, they have access to a ton of information, and they can ask some really pointy questions for sure. So we've now leveraged the fact that space is so inspirational and popular that we've leveraged it and put in place a number of programs where we go out there and we purposefully look at using our popularity to bring children to understand that, one, they need to stay in school, and that, two, if we can, is to entice them to join some of the science, technology, engineering, and math programs out there, because they represent, the follow up workforce for our various industries and our research capabilities.
What are the current missions or research topics or areas of focus for the program?
Well, we have quite a number. So a bit like NASA, we are about science, we are about discovery. But contrary to the US, all of the space activities are concentrated at the Canadian Space Agency. So although a lot of space takes place in NOAA, for example, right? And we don't have we don't have a NOAA equivalent that does space in Canada. So, but we do have a department for the environment, a department for natural resources, for fisheries, and they use us as the coordinator for all of the space activities. So we do science with all of them. So at any given point, we've got scientific missions that are collecting different data with respect to the ozone, with respect to different types of chemicals in the atmosphere. We've got scientific instruments on Mars. In fact, on the Curiosity rover, we've got scientific experiments with the European folks looking at water quality, water inventory, and whatnot. So at any given point, we're doing work, scientific work, and R&D in the whole gamut of scientific interests that can be leveraged from space.
What are the industries or areas like medicine or whatever it might be that stand in line to benefit most from this research?
Well, if we go back to our contribution to the ISS, one of the most visible ones is clearly robotics, right? So because of the Canadarm, the robotic arm and whatnot, we've developed a very comprehensive strength in robotics. Now we're combining that with artificial intelligence to give those robots as much autonomy as possible going forward. So clearly robotics, and of course you can't do robotics in space without optics. So robotics and optics are key areas of technological strength that create a big economic impact. But for the last 20 years or so, Canada has focused all of our research on the ISS on life sciences. That's not a very well-known fact, but over that we've made quite a number of
what does that
interesting
encompass? Tell us
discoveries.
what life sciences encompasses.
The space environment is harsh to the body, and that environment creates a situation where the astronaut's body reacts very quickly to things like aging. Right, the hardening of arteries and pressures in your brain and loss of vision, the loss of your calcium in your bones and whatnot. So consider aging as a situation where people on Earth go through the same thing. But whereas on Earth it takes 20 to 40 years to go through that, astronauts go through it in 6 months. So it provides a fantastic medical platform for people that do research in the medical field to actually look at how we can actually look at preventing some of those things like osteoporosis, for example, right? So it's a fantastic opportunity for us to push the medical research to a point where it becomes beneficial to people on Earth.
What the debate that is ongoing since the dawn of space exploration between use of robotics or use of human beings. What are your thoughts on that?
So I think every astronaut dreams of an extravehicular mission, right? Where they put on a spacesuit and they go.
And much of the public who watches
they go
those
out there.
astronauts
It is, so I'd hate to say it, but a lot of the robotics that we've put forward have greatly reduced the number of extravehicular activities. So much to the demise of our astronauts. But realistically, when you look at managing the programs and making sure that we've got a safe operation on the ISS, when we can do something with the Canadarm and Dexter, our dexterous robot, that does not require an astronaut to go out there. We look at balancing the risks, right? And of course, if the robot can do it to our satisfaction and still have success, we prefer to use the robot out there.
So beyond the cooperation with the International Space Station, which involves Canada and 4 other nations, who are some of your other partners in space?
Well, certainly our biggest collaborator is the Americans, and we look at nurturing that as much as we can. But we have had cooperation and have engaged in a number of relationship building activities with a lot of other countries. And little known fact, Canada is has a particular status as part of the European Space Agency. So, they like to say over there's 22 member states in the European Space Agency and Canada. Right, so that brings about an interesting gamut or spectrum of collaboration opportunities there as well. And we've invested substantially with respect to some of the European-led missions.
Final thought is, when you look ahead to the possibilities and the projects, what most excites you?
Well, I think I'd be from a personal perspective, and I like to call myself a space geek as well. And I know what is of most interest to the public. The fact that humanity is going back to the moon and then preparing the way for Mars is compelling, right? So compelling as a human being, but also compelling as an administrator. So as I look forward to the future, we've got a fantastic opportunity to contribute to this future-looking, humankind endeavor, and I look forward to what Canada can contribute to that mission. But I'd be remiss if I also did not acknowledge the fact that we've got quite a number of opportunities out there to do science from space. Science looking at climate change, looking at soil erosion, looking at ice flows, and looking at making sure that we here on Earth can continue to live in a safe environment. So I'm talking about search and rescue capabilities. I'm talking about ways to respond to disasters and to help first responders with very clear imaging of what's happening in a disaster area. So yes, as a space geek, I have a little bit of preference and anticipation with respect to our contribution to the lunar program, but the other stuff is just as important as well, and we're making sure that we're keeping an eye on those priorities.
Well, from one space geek to another, thank you very much for spending time with us today and sharing these really visionary thoughts. It's really inspiring.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.